Chapter 1, Empire and the Emergence of World Powers, 1870 to 1919. This chapter considers the expansion of established colonial powers Britain and France and the emergence of Germany, Japan, and the USA as the imperial powers between 1870 and 1919. It analyzes their ambitions, particularly in Africa and China, and their acquisition of colonies and protectorates throughout the world. Why was imperialism a significant force for the late 19th century Europe? 1.1 Economic and political motives for imperial expansionism. There was a so-called scramble for Africa as European powers took control of areas not formally controlled before. There was also expansion in Southeast Asia by France and Britain. The USA becomes a colonial power in the Pacific, Hawaii, and Philippines, and Japan acquired overseas possessions in the Pacific. The powers hasted to acquire ports in China, while Russia expanded its control over areas of Central Asia and the Far East. Imperialism became a major element in the world, with a new belief in the destiny of great powers to dominate other peoples. Economic motives. European states were expanding their trade and industry and looking for markets for the goods they manufactured, and businesses and investors thought that it would be profitable to invest in the new trading companies that were being formed to trade in Africa and China. Also, since more and more countries were introducing tariffs, the possession of colonies was seen as the only way to guarantee access to vital raw materials needed by modern industrial economies. Businesses in Marseilles, Liverpool, and Hamburg were, for example, constantly pushing their governments into annexing areas where they had important trading interests. There was often an exaggerated and wildly inaccurate belief in the potential wealth of new colonies. Political motives. However, economic factors are really only half the explanation for the new imperialism. It can just as well be argued that politics and international diplomacy played as great or even greater part. Britain's occupation of Egypt in 1882, which was carried out to safeguard the Suez Canal as the main route to India, and the draft Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of 1884, concentrating the Congo, set off a chain reaction among the other European powers that, even if it didn't directly lead to the partition of Africa, certainly sped the process up. The emergence of the new imperialism. In the middle of the 19th century, interest in colonies had declined in Europe. In an era of free trade, it seemed that political control of overseas markets was unnecessary. In 1865, a parliamentary committee even recommended that Britain should withdraw from its bases on the west coast of Africa. However, within 20 years, the political climate had dramatically changed, and the European governments, edged on by their populations, were fiercely competing for colonies in Africa, and by 1900 seemed poised to carve up China. Between 1870 and 1900, the empires of the European nations underwent a spectacular expansion. The British Empire, which was by far the largest, increased in size by nearly 5 million square miles, 13 million square meters, and in 1900 comprised of 1/5 of the world, while the French Empire expanded from 700 square miles, 1.8 kilometers squared, to 6 million, 15.5 million kilometers squared, and its population grew from 5 million to 52 million. As at the same time, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the USA all acquired colonial possessions, the size of which, however, were dwarfed by the long-established, substantial British and French empires. It was this dramatic expansion overseas that historians have called the New Imperialism. It was made possible by the technological lead the European powers had over Africa, China, and much more of the rest of Asia. The Maxim gun, the steamboat, Kunik, and financial power made the Europeans ultimately invincible. Nature and purpose of the scramble for Africa. The early stages. In 1870, only 10% of the African continent was under European control. By 1900, only Liberia and Ethiopia were independent. As the start of this period, little was known by the Europeans about the interior of Africa, and any attempts by Europeans to explore it proved extremely difficult because of disease and the lack of suitable transport. However, interest was growing in Africa for a number of reasons. 1. The development of steamboats enabled merchants to sell manufactured goods and textiles in exchange for tropical products such as groundnuts, peanuts, and palm oil. Number 2. Missionary societies and churches were also kept to open up Africa to Christianity and convert African people. This was made all the more urgent by their determination to stamp out the slave trade, which still existed in Africa despite attempts to prohibit it by Britain after 1807. The press and newly founded geographical societies increasingly interested Europeans in the dramatic journeys across the African continent undertaken by explorers. Governments welcomed the discoveries of the explorers, hoping that they would open up Africa to their country exports. It was David Livingstone whose explorations in Africa made such an impression on both Americans and Europeans. In 1854 to 56, he was the first European to cross the African continent. He discovered Lake Nyasa and the Zambezi, which he hoped would become highways for the new steamboats. In an adroit PR gesture, he named the Great Missouri Falls the Smoke That Thunders. The Victorian Falls, like Livingstone's book, Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa, was aimed at persuading the public opinion and the governments to support his plans for establishing a British colony of settlers in Zambian highlands. He was convinced that once this was established, it would, in words of the historian Nia Ferguson, radiate civilizing waves until the whole continent had been cleansed of superstition and slavery. Livingstone was arguably the most famous of the explorers, but there were others such as Richard Burton, John Speck, Vernie Cameron, Henry Morton Stanley, the German Gustav Nachel, and the Frenchman Jules Dexter's, whose discoveries revealed the potential of Africa to the European states and played a key part in the first stage of the scramble for Africa. King Leopold of Belgium and the scramble for the Congo. In September 1876, King Leopold set up the International African Association, IAA. Its declared aim was to suppress the slave trade and open up Central Africa to international commerce, but in reality he was secretly scheming, as he wrote to the Belgian ambassador in London, of getting us a slice of this magnificent African cake. In 1879, with his encouragement, Piers Brazza and Stanley organized two separate expeditions in the name of the IAA to open up the Lower Congo. Unknown to Leopold, Brazza had secret instructions to annex the territory of the Lower Congo for France. Despite initial success, he failed, but on his return to France, unsuccessful and bankrupt, he found himself a hero and gained widespread public support for French ambitions in the Congo. The Anglo-French quarrel over Egypt and its consequences. Egypt was a self-governing territory within the Turkish Empire, which was ruled by the Khedive. The Suez Canal, which was opened in 1869, was built by a French company and rapidly became a key link in Britain's communications with India, which was Britain's wealthiest and most important possession. In April 1876, Egypt went bankrupt and could no longer pay the interest of the money lent by European investors. Britain and France, the majority shareholder in the Suez Canal Company, took over joint control of Egypt's finances. In 1881, both powers were challenged by a nationalist uprising led by officers in the Egypt army. As the French parliament vetoed the dispatch of French troops, it was left to the British to defeat the uprising. The British now became the masters of Egypt, and despite repeated assurances that they would leave as soon as order had been restored, did not do so. The impact of the quarrel on Anglo-French relations in West Africa. Inevitably, this infuriated the French, who set out to thwart British attempts both in Egypt and in West Africa. Alarmed by the prospect of a French advance into the Congo in May 1884, Britain signed the Draft Congo Treaty with Portugal, which acknowledged Portugal's claims to the Lower Congo, while allowing Britain to trade freely there and to have a monopoly of navigational rights on the Congo River. This, the British government hoped, would provide an effective barrier to any French expansion. In protest, France appealed to Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor, to force Portugal to renounce the Congo Treaty. In November, despite British objections, Bismarck summoned a conference in Berlin attended by 15 other countries, which decided that the Congo was to be administered by Leopold's International African Association and to allow the other colonial powers to trade freely there. German participation. The creation of the German colonial empire, 1884 to 85. In 1884 to 85, Bismarck had surprised both his own ministers and the other imperial powers by annexing territory in southwest Africa, the Cameroon, and East Africa. What persuaded Bismarck so suddenly to create a German empire in Africa? His main motive was probably to place himself in a position where he could cooperate with France against the British in order to distract the French from their intention of revenging their defeat of 1870 by German when France lost the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine. He was also influenced by the cries for help from North German colonial traders, such as F.L. Luders, the Burman tobacco merchant, to recognize his acquisition of a small trading post on the southwest African coast at the Anaga Pico. The mercantile cities of Hamburg and Bremen also feared that their merchants might be shut out of African markets. German public opinion, influenced by the newly founded German colonial union and newspapers, was convinced that Africa was an Eldorado of enormous wealth. Bismarck, like Desire, the British Prime Minister, who grasped how imperialism could unite the German people and discourage criticism of the government. One eminent German historian, H.U. Weller, has called this social imperialism. The scramble completed, 1885 to 98. The Berlin Conference speeded up the scramble for Africa as rules were now drawn up for defining how the imperial powers could legitimately claim African territory on the coast of the continent and exclude their rivals. This would only happen if the powers already effectively controlled the area they wished legally to annex. Yet this did not lead to an amicable partition of the rest of Africa. On the contrary, over the next 13 years, there was intense rivalry between the colonizing powers. As one French minister put it, the scramble became a steeplechase competition for territory. Influence and trading rights focused on the Sudan, East Africa, and West Africa hinterland, and the ambitious plans of Cecil Rhodes to create a vast area of British territory between the Transvaal in southern Africa and what later became Rhodesia. Britain and Germany partitioned East Africa, 1886 to 90. West Africa was partitioned between Germany, France, and Britain, 1884 to 1899. The British expanded in South Africa and annexed the Boer republics of Transvaal and Natal, and the territory which later became Rhodesia, 1890 to 1902. The reasons for the accelerated partition of Africa, 1885, were diverse and complex. 1. Economic factors continued to be important in East Africa, where British and German interests clashed. Britain had major trading interests in Zanzibar, which imposed British cloth and manufactured goods, and exported ivory, rubber, and hides from the interior of Africa. Beyond the coastal region lay the temperature areas lying between Lakes Victoria and Takanaki, which was suitable for European settlements and farming. To control this profitable area, intense competition developed between the German East African Company and the Imperial British East African Company. Similarly, in both West and South Africa, economic factors had a role to play. In West Africa, between 1886 and 1889, Sir George Goldie's Royal Niger Company aggressively advanced British interests on the lower Niger and Benue rivers, as well as defending British economic interests from French competition beyond the borders of what later became Nigeria. In South Africa, Cecil Rhodes' annexation of what was later to be called Rhodesia was financed by the British South African Company and the diamond trade. Political factors, particularly nationalism, were important in European colonial expansion in the Sudan and in both West and South Africa. To compensate for its defeat by Germany in Europe 1870 and its humiliation in Egypt by Britain, France aimed to carve out for itself a massive sphere of influence stretching from Algeria and Tunis to the Gulf of Guinea, nearly a quarter of the African continent. In August 1890, Britain accepted French claims in West Africa, but the boundaries of the three British colonies of Nigeria and Gold Coast and Gambia were left undefined. Consequently, on-the-spot rivalry between Goldie's Royal Niger Company and French traders, backed up by locally based French military units, continued until 1899. It was nationalism, too, that motivated French attempts to block British attempts to re-establish Anglo-Egyptian control over the Sudan by dispatching the Marchland expedition to occupy the Upper Nile. In South Africa, German support and sympathy for the Boers inflamed public opinion in Britain. While the Boer War, in its early stages anyway, had massive public support in Britain, conversely, the war antagonized public opinion in Germany and France. Strategic aims of the imperial powers also influenced the scramble for Africa. In South Africa, for instance, the discovery of gold in Transvaal and the growth of German economic and political influence there convinced the British that the Boer republics of the Orange Free State and Transvaal needed to be absorbed into British South Africa before they drew too close to Germany. Again, it was strategic reasons that ensured that control of Egypt and ultimately of Sudan was firmly in British hands. Sometimes strategic reasons could also dictate concessions by the imperial powers. In 1890, the German government conceded Zanzibar to Britain in exchange for the return of the important North Sea naval base of Heligoland. Once France recognized British control of Egypt and the Sudan, Britain was ready to recognize French claims in West Africa. The Upper Nile and Fashoda crises. Thanks to its control of Egypt, Britain was also responsible for its possessions in the Sudan. In the early 1880s, a Wahhabite revolution had taken place in the Sudan and the Mahdi. Its leader was determined to drive the British out. In this, he was largely successful. He massacred 10,000 Egyptian troops under a British commander at the Battle of Obed in November 1883. In the following year, defeated another Anglo-Egyptian force under General Gordon, which had been sent to relieve Khartoum. The consequences of this was that a power vacuum was created, which the Maltese army, the Ethiopians, the French, and the Italians all competed to fill. In 1896, when Italy was defeated in its attempt to conquer Ethiopia at Adwa, the Mahdi immediately attempted to exploit the situation to attack the small Italian colony of Kassala. In response to appeals for help, the British moved troops from Egypt
some 200 miles up the Nile to threaten the Mahdi's troops in Dongolang, the capital of northern Sudan. The French government saw this as the first step in the British reconquest of the Sudan and ordered a small military expedition under Colonel Marchand to proceed from the French Congo to the Upper Nile. The French were convinced that the occupation of the Upper Nile would enable France to build a huge dam in the swamps of Fashoda, which would control Egypt's vital water supplies and therefore give them effectively the power of life and death over the Egyptian economy. In response, Lord Salisbury ordered General Kitchener, the commander-in-chief of the Egyptian forces, to reconquer the Sudan. Kitchener destroyed the Mahdi's forces at Omdurman in September 1898. However, Marchand had already reached the Upper Nile and hoisted the French flag at Fashoda. Kitchener immediately sent 5 gunboats down the Nile to challenge him. An armed clash that could have led to war was avoided when he decided not use force to eject the French. Instead, it was left to the two governments to find a diplomatic solution. France, lacking any support from the other powers, had little option but to concede totally to British demands in the Sudan. What caused the scramble for Africa? The explanations for the scramble for Africa, which was by far the most dramatic development of the new imperialism, have been the subject of continuous disagreement and debate by historians and economists almost from the time that it occurred. Until the early 1950s, the view put forward by the early 20th century liberals and socialists was that it was mainly economic factors that triggered the scramble for Africa. They were convinced that the imperialist powers were driven into annexing African territory in order to secure guaranteed export markets. The most influential of these writers was J.A. Hobson, whose arguments influenced not only Lenin and the political left, but also a much wider group of historians and economists. Some 50 years later, it was argued that the scramble for Africa could be explained by the global extension of European rivalries. In 1953, Ronald Robinson and Jack Gallagher, in their influential book Africa and the Victorians, put forward the view that the scramble for Africa was caused by the dual crises in Egypt and South Africa. Both the Egyptian nationalist uprising led by Colonel Arabi and the growing hostility of the Boer republics in South Africa threatened British power in key territories, guarding the route between Britain and British India, the Suez Canal, and the Cape. This argument broke decisively with the notion that the scramble was caused by economic and political factors originating in Europe. Instead, the catalyst for the scramble oriented in Africa itself. This argument was that the scramble for Africa was essentially a consequence of the problems in Egypt and South Africa has been met with much criticism. Some much more recent historians argue that it was the French policies rather than British that triggered the scramble, or economic factors were after all important, or individuals like Cecile Rhodes, Karl Peets, and King Leopard of Belgium played key roles that triggered the scramble. Clearly, the scramble for Africa was a complex event caused by many factors, including economic considerations, the ambition of local European traders or soldiers, the sudden interest of Italy and Germany in acquiring African territory, the desire to convert African people to Christianity, popular backing for imperialism, local development in Egypt, South Africa, and the Congo, the vast technological superiority of the Europeans over the Africans. There are many detailed studies of these individual factors, but all these need to be brought together to understand the reasons for the scramble. In an effort to plug this gap has been made by Thomas Paquin in his massive book, The Scramble for Africa, 1991, in which he emphasizes initially the 3 C's: commerce, Christianity, and civilization. To this he added a 4th C, conquest, which eventually became the most important of the lot. Reasons for and the extent of domestic support for overseas expansion in Britain, France, and Germany. Increasingly, in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, European governments, backed by public opinion, began to believe that their states could remain great nations only if they had colonial empires, which could provide trade and raw materials. By 1900 imperialism had developed in what the historian Norman Riches called a massive cult. The imperial idea was popularized by patriotic and colonial societies, and the new nationalist press, it did too, provide excitement and the feeling that one's country was superior to other people and races. Britain. In December 1884, Lord Derby, the colonial minister, wrote to Gladstone, the prime minister, that the British public is just now in a very aggressive and inquisitive mood. Over the next 20 years, the British public's support for what was called the new imperialism became even louder. Some historians argue that this was essentially a defensive reaction, since Britain was facing growing economic and political challenges, particularly from Germany and the USA. In other words, the new imperialism trumped the might of the British Empire just at a time when it was in the early stages of economic decline. There are other reasons for its popularity. For many whose lives were determined by routine work in offices or back-bearing labor in factories, it was above all exciting. The discoveries of the explorers and the colonial wars, which involved a small professional army, were covered in detail in the press. The new press, particularly the Daily Mail, took a strong imperialist line, which, to judge by its rapidly rising circulation figures, must have been a popular topic. As the historian Niall Ferguson has written, no medium was safe from the new imperialism. Popular adventure books of the empire were published, for example, and it was a constant theme in adventure. The application of a distorted view of Charles Darwin's idea to politics and humanity, which advanced the argument that Britain and the northern European nations and the USA were superior races and a unique right and duty to govern Africa and much of Asia. Critics of the new imperialism. While support for the new imperialism in Britain was widespread, there were a number of groups that influenced people who did not hesitate to criticize some of the characteristics and policies. Most Christian missionaries, for instance, were committed to improve the life of Africans, and therefore saw the empire as a civilizing rather than conquering force. Anthropologists were also beginning to study the customs of indigenous African communities on their own terms, rather than viewing them as an inferior species. The strongest critics of the new imperialism were the radical wing of the Liberal Party and members of the ILP, Independent Labour Party. But they accepted the empire as a fact and sought to reform it in the interest of its subject peoples. India and Egypt were in time to be given limited self-government, but they did not think that Africa was yet ready for self-government, although they thought that the colonial powers should respect the human rights of Africans and their own lives. When the Boer War broke out in 1899, it was welcomed with enormous enthusiasm by the supporters of the new imperialism. The critics of the war, branded as the pro-Boers, were soundly defeated in the general election of 1900. However, the war did not lead to a speedy British victory. Instead, the Boers waged a guerrilla war, which lasted until 1902. To defeat the guerrillas, the British interned Boer farmers and their families in concentration camps, where, though bad food, poor sanitation, and overcrowding, on average 117 per 1,000 perished. when the press revealed the concentration camp scandal, there was a revulsion against the Jaganism of the new imperialism, and it was one of the factors that led to the sweeping victory of the Liberal Party in 1906. France. One of the key reasons for the creation of the French colonial empire was to overcome the legacy of humiliation left by defeats at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 and at Sedan in 1870. The conquest of an empire ensured that France and French culture had a global role, and as the historian Robert Tomes observed, was a remedy for self-doubt, and that it awakened national pride and appeared to make France great again. However, some French nationalists like Paul de Blody argued that France's attention would better be concentrated in Europe on regaining from Germany the lost provided of Alsace and Lorraine. Imperialism's most enthusiastic supporters were found in the French elite army officers, the colonial group of deputies in parliament, and members of the various pressure groups and geographical societies outside parliament. But how much support for the empire was there in France as a whole? The press and parliament swung between resentment at the cost of expansion and outbursts of Jaganism and rage when France was outwitted by a rival power, as by Germany at Fashoda in 1998. The politician Jules Ferry remarked in 1889 that all the interests the French public about the empire is the belly dance. On the other hand, apart from anti-militarists and anarchists, the majority of the French accepted that the empire was a national asset. Even the socialist leader Jean Jaurès, while rejecting the wars of conquest, stressed that the Socialist Party have always supported the peaceful expansion of French interests in civilization. The French imperial mission was fully supported by Catholics, whose missionaries in Africa looked to the French authorities for assistance and protection. In schools throughout France, children were taught about the benefits of French imperialism, but how much impact this had is again hard to judge. It provided difficult to recruit effective civilian colonial administrators, and of all those appointed between 1900 and 1914, hardly 50% had any secondary education. The French public may have generally approved of the empire, but according to historian Robert Tomes, it had little knowledge or concrete interest in the colonies. Germany. Domestic support for Italian General support for imperialism in Germany was more widespread than in France. To a certain extent, it was a development of German nationalism from earlier in the 19th century. German imperialism began to take shape in an ideology when two important books were published. Frederick Fabry's Does Germany Need Colonies? And William Hubert Schweitzer, German Kolonialism. Both books stressed how important it was for Germany to spread its culture globally through the acquisition of colonies, and to ensure that it too had a colonial empire in a world that would increasingly be ruled by great empires. The ideas in these books led to the formation of the German colonial union, which did much to make the prospect of a German colonial empire popular. It was Bismarck, of course, who at a stroke created most of the empire, mainly for foreign political reasons, but as a wily politician, he also knew that supporters for imperialism was building up among the German public. In 1884 to 1885, the German newspapers reported that a real fever for colonies existed among the German people. 10 years later, imperialism was supported not only by German intellects like Max Weber and the German political parties, with the partial exception of the German Social Democratic Party, but it also began to emerge as an aggressive populist mass movement promoted by such nationalist organizations as the Pan-German League and the Navy League. These demanded that Germany should acquire new colonies and have its place in the sun. Germany was a new power which had only been united in 1871 behind the German imperialism of the 1890s lay the desire for recognition of Germany as a great global power by the European states. What was the impact of imperial expansion on international relations? 1.2. The impact of the growth of overseas empires on relations between European nations. Relations between all four of the leading European nations were influenced by the growth of their overseas empires. The impact of the German overseas empire on international relations. German unification in 1871 after the defeat of France had created a strong power with immense economic and military potential in the middle of Europe. Bismarck's aim until his recognition was to isolate France and avoid a major war on the continent of Europe. It was thus vital to prevent the outbreak of Austro-Russia war over the future of the Balkans, which might rapidly spread to the rest of Europe, and provide France with an opportunity to put pressure on Germany to hand back Alsace-Lorraine. This task became increasingly difficult as the accelerating decline of Turkish power opened up the prospect of the collapse of the Turkish Empire in the Balkans. The accelerating decline of the Turkish Empire in the Balkans left a power vacuum which both Austria and Russia competed to fill. This nearly led to a war in 1878 and again in 1885 to 87. Bismarck feared that an Austro-German war might quickly escalate into a European war and give France an opportunity to regain this territory. Alsace-Lorraine it had lost to Germany in 1871. By 1913, Turkey had lost virtually all its Balkan empire. Bismarck consequently did not hesitate to exploit colonial tensions to strengthen Germany's position in Europe. He made no secret of the fact that he wished to encourage France to seek compensation for the loss of Alsace-Lorraine by building up a colonial empire in Africa. This would both distract France from seeking revenge against Germany and create tension with the other colonial powers, particularly in Britain. This was his main reasons for supporting France in its quarrel with Britain and Egypt. However, Franco-German cooperation was short-lived. The threat of a Russo-Austrian-Bulgarian war scare in 1885 and the coming to power of a new French government, whose charismatic minister of war, General Georges Boulanger, believed that it was his mission to prepare the war against Germany caused Bismarck abruptly to end this colonial policy in Africa and once more focus on Europe. For Bismarck, the continent of Europe, not Africa. This was his priority. He once told a Russian explorer that, "My map of Africa lies in Europe. Here is Russia and here is France." When Bismarck resigned in 1890, his successor, General von Caprivi, decided to work for a new alliance system or new course, which would ally Britain with Germany's two other allies, Italy and Austria, and so hold in check both Russia and France. In an attempt to achieve this, Caprivi was ready to settle any outstanding colonial disagreements in East Africa. However, the problem for the Germans was that while the British government was ready to settle colonial disputes with them, as eventually it also did with France and Russia, it was not prepared to negotiate binding alliances. Berlin refused to believe that
this and remained convinced that sooner or later French and Russian pressure on Britain's large and vulnerable empire would end in war and force Britain to turn to Germany for help. Consequently, in a series of colonial disputes involving the Saman Islands, the boundaries of the Sudan, and more importantly, the Transvaal in South Africa, the Germans took a strongly anti-British position in the hope that Britain would draw the conclusion that it was better off to have Germany as a friend rather than an enemy. Ultimately, however, this was wishful thinking, and the British were determined not to join the Triple Alliance because, as Lord Salisbury, the British Prime Minister, observed, the liability of having to defend the German and Austrian frontiers against Russia is greater than having to defend the British Isles against France. After the crisis with Britain over the Transvaal in 1896, the German government drew two conclusions. Imperialism was popular with much of the German public. However, to gain the size of empire which a growing number of Germans thought was their due, Germany would have to build a fleet of warships to challenge the supremacy of the British Navy. The decision was to have a decisive impact on Anglo-German relations. Until the fleet was constructed, German colonial policy could only be opportune. As the historian Matthew Sigeman put it, the fact that German diplomats were always hovering near the world's trouble spots, looking to gain territorial compensation out of any unfortunate incident, quickly alienated the other powers. The two Moroccan crises of 1905 to 06 and 1911 were to illustrate this. The impact of the growth of the overseas empires on France's relations with the other European nations. France had two enemies in Europe. It was Germany. Elsewhere, it was the British Empire. In the scramble for Africa and Burma, Siam, and the Pacific Islands, there was intense Anglo-French rivalry. At Fedosha in the southern Sudan, the two countries came near to war. Yet the realization that France was powerless to challenge Britain's position in Egypt and the Sudan persuaded de Classe, the French foreign minister, to negotiate a far-reaching entente. With Britain in 1904, the so-called Entente Cordiale, the essence of this agreement was that France would recognize Britain's position in Egypt if it in return would not object to France maintaining law and order in Morocco and at some future date establishing a protectorate there. The Entente was not an alliance, but forceful German intervention in the Moroccan question was to drive Britain and France closer together. The impact on Britain of the growth of overseas empires of the other European states. The British Empire suffered from what historians call imperial overstretch. Britain's huge empire and worldwide interests made it vulnerable to German, French, and Russian pressure, and its potential weakness was shown by the fact that it took Britain 3 years to win the Boer War, once its vital interests in India, Egypt, and South Africa were safeguarded. It was ready to negotiate agreements and ententes to ease the pressure of its huge empire. In 1902, the Anglo-Japanese alliance protected it from a hostile alliance of the European powers in East Asia. An agreement with France would also remove a major source of worldwide pressure on the empire. Negotiations began in 1903, but were speeded up by the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War, as both states wanted to avoid that what the historian John Lau has called the nightmare scenario of Britain and France having to fight each other as the seconds of their allies. The Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911. It was the dramatic German interventions in Morocco in 1905 and 1911 that turned the Entente into what amounted to an unofficial or informal alliance between the two countries. In March 1905, the Kaiser interrupted his Mediterranean cruise to land at Tangier by greeting the Sultan of Morocco. Pointedly, as an independent ruler, he indicated that Germany did not accept France's position in Morocco. The Germans then demanded a conference on the future of Morocco and the resignation of de Classe. At first, it seemed that Berlin had won a significant success. The French agreed to a conference and de Classe resigned, but when the conference opened at AICE in German 1906, the majority of states, including the USA, agreed that France had a special economic and security interest in Morocco. Together with the Spanish, the French were therefore entrusted with the supervision of the Moroccan police and the country's finances. Although the Germans did not win a concession that all the powers should enjoy equal economic rights with Morocco, the first Moroccan crisis was, as the historian A.J.P. Taylor has stressed, a true crisis, a turning point in European history. For the first time since 1870, a Franco-German war seemed a real possibility. After it, the German High Command developed the Schlieffen Plan and began to prepare for a European war on two fronts, while the British and French military staffs also began seriously to discuss what action should be taken if Germany invaded France. In May 1911, Germany made a second attempt to assert its influence in Morocco. When it became clear that France, contrary to the agreement of 1906, was going to occupy Morocco, a German gunboat, the Panther, was dispatched to Agadir. The hope was at Kaidler Wachter, the German foreign secretary, expressed it that by seizing a territorial pawn, the imperial government will be placed in a position to give the Moroccan affair a turn which should cause the earlier setbacks of 1905 to pass into oblivion. Again, this led to a decisive intervention by the British government, which made clear that it would not tolerate German influence in Morocco, as it feared that the Germans would build a naval base there, which would be a threat to British sea power. It further strengthened Britain's ties with both France and Russia, and Germany became more isolated. The impact on Russia of the growth of overseas empires of the other European states. The Russian defeat by Japan in 1905 and the weakening of its position in East Asia had a significant impact on its relations with the European powers. Above all, it made a colonial agreement possible with Britain. The British had long wished to negotiate a compromise that would take Russian pressures off Afghanistan and northern India. Russia had little option but to improve relation with London if it was to maintain its alliance with France, who now enjoyed increasingly good relationships with Britain. The Anglo-Russian agreement was signed in August 1907. Like the Anglo-French agreement, it was concerned only with colonial matters. The Russians gave up all its claims to Afghanistan and recognized British interests in Tibet. Persia, present-day Iran, was divided into zones of influence. The north went to Russia, the south to Britain, and a neutral zone in between. Both empires recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. The Anglo-Russian agreement, together with the Entente Cordiale, formed a triple Entente. Although it was not a formal alliance system, it did mark a shift in the balance of power in Europe. No longer could the Germans assume that an Anglo-Russian war would break out that would enable them to force Britain or Russia into becoming a subordinate ally. Russia's defeat in East Asia by Japan
also refocused its attention back to the Balkans and the European continent. Imperial rivalries in the outbreak of the First World War. For Germany, France, Russia, Austria, and even Britain, the causes of the First World War were primarily European, even though in Britain's case, especially colonial rivalry with Germany had aggravated relations. Russia's defeat by Japan forced Russia to turn back to Europe and focus on the Balkans. Germany's clumsy attempt to break up the Entente by intervening in Morocco and its construction of a battle fleet to rival the Royal Navy clearly emphasized the danger of the German challenge to Britain and made it more determined to stop the German domination of Europe. By early 1914, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire within Europe, Siberia, backed by Russia, emerged as a major threat to Austria, as its intention was to liberate the South Slavs from Austrian control. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the heir to Austro-Hungarian throne, at Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, by Serb terrorists, gave Austria the chance to counter this threat by declaring war on Serbia. This step was, however, fraught with danger, as it could all too easily cause a European war by triggering the alliance system. The assassination brought together all the explosive tensions in Europe, which, thanks to the alliance system, resulted in the outbreak of the First World War. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914. The critical events leading to the war were as follows. Germany gave Austria its unconditional support against Serbia on July 5th. Austria sent an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding that Austria should supervise counter-terrorist measures to be taken by the Serb police. When this was rejected by Serbia, Austria declared war on July 28th. Russia began to mobilize its army in support of Serbia. Germany could not allow its only reliable ally, Austria, to which it had been allied since 1879, to be humiliated by Serbia and Russia, and declared war on Russia on August 1st. Once Germany declared war on Russia, France, which was allies to Russia, could not stand back and see Russia defeated. The Germans, anticipating this, declared war on France August 2nd and invaded Belgium on August 4th. Britain, despite initial hesitations, could not afford to run the risk of a German victory and declared war on Germany on August 4th. Disputes with China over imperial expansion. The opening up of China to Western influence. A major step in opening of China to Western influence was the Treaty of Nanking of August 1842. The British forced the Chinese not only to import opium from India, but also to cede them the island of Hong Kong and to open up 5 coastal cities to foreign traders. Over the next 50 years, further concessions were forced out of the Chinese. For instance, by the Peking Treaties of October 1860, 11 more treaty ports were opened up. Russia expansion into China. As in Africa, great power rivalry in China was determined by a mixture of political, economic, and strategical factors. By 1816, Russia had become a Pacific power by expanding into the Chinese Amur and Maritime provinces, and wished to round off these gains by annexing Manchuria, opening up its market to Russian imports, and acquiring an ice-free port in Korea, which China still theoretically controlled. Inevitably, these moves were opposed by Britain, which up to this point, though its superior sea power, had been able to dominate China's trade. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway by Russia, which commenced in 1891, completely changed the situation, as Russia would now be able to deploy troops to back up its demands in China. Unlike in Africa, Britain faced the prospect of a challenge of its commercial position from a
for major military land power, Russia could usually rely on the backing of France and Germany and China, while Britain's only potential ally was Japan, which saw Russian expansion into Korea and Manchuria as a threat to its own security. Japanese and Russian expansion in China and its impact on international relations. Like Britain, Japan was opposed to the growth of Russian influence in Manchuria and Korea. Its chance to strengthen its position in Korea came in 1894 when a rebellion broke out against the Korean government, which theoretically owed loyalty to the emperor in Beijing. Both China and Japan sent troops which rapidly crushed the revolt. However, when it became clear that Tokyo was not going to withdraw its forces, China declared war on Japan, but was quickly defeated and forced to accept the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which effectively set up Japanese protectorates in Korea, Taiwan, Formosa, the predecessors in the Liaodong Peninsula, and the important port of Port Arthur lay. Britain welcomed the treaty as it created a buffer between its interests in southern China and Russia's expanding sphere of influence in the north. To the Russians, however, it was a serious blow to their ambitions for acquiring an ice-free port in Korea and terminating the Trans-Siberian Railway as Port Arthur. They therefore organized a joint European protest to force the Japanese to renegotiate the treaty. Not surprisingly, the British remained aloof, but the Germans immediately supported the Russians, calculating that this would strengthen their position in Europe because it would encourage Russia to become involved in China rather than the Balkans, make a Russo-British war over China more likely, and both sides would then look to Germany for support, force France to support Russia and China, even though the French government wanted to refocus Russian interest away from China back to Europe. As the Germans intended, the French supported the Russians to form what diplomats called the Far Eastern Triplets, which successfully forced the Japanese to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China. The Germans and French gained little from their membership of the Triplets, but it enabled the Russians significantly to strengthen their position. In 1896, they forced Japan to agree to a joint Russo-Japanese protectorate over Korea. They also signed a treaty with China promising its military assistance in the event of being attacked by Japan, and in return were given permission to extend the Trans-Siberian Railway across Manchuria to Vladivostok. The scramble for China. The chief consequences of the Japanese victory was to encourage the other imperial powers to demand more concessions from China for themselves. As in Africa, Germany was not prepared to play a passive role in China like the other European powers. It was attracted by the potential of the huge Chinese market of 450 million people, the murder of 2 German missionaries in Shantung in 1897 provided Berlin with a convenient pretext to seize Kaisha as a site for a coaling station and naval base. This then triggered a chain reaction, and it looked as if partition of China was about to begin. The Russians led the way by seizing Port Arthur and Dalian on the Liaodong Peninsula in December 1897 and forcing China to grant them a 25-year lease. The British insisted on a similar lease on Wailway, which was to run as long as the Russian lease of Liaodong. The French then demanded a 99-year lease on the Guangzhou Peninsula in southern China. The Boxer Rebellion. Not surprisingly, these demands led to an anti-Western backlash in China, and in summer of 1900, the Boxer Rebellion broke out. The Boxer movement was essentially a patriotic and populist reaction to the increasing foreign domination of China. The Boxers were particularly hostile to the Christian missionaries, of whom there were nearly 2,000 in China by 1900, as they perceived them to be undermining the traditional Chinese way of life. The Boxers, united in righteousness as they called themselves, first appeared as a force in the spring of 1898 in the Shandong province. The following year, their numbers were swollen by drought and famine, for which they blamed the Christians. Armed bands of Boxers advanced towards Beijing, massacring ministries and Chinese Christian converts on the way. The initial reaction of the treaty powers then have an excuse to intervene and restore order, and so strengthen their grip on China. On June 20th, the Chinese government, emboldened by the partisan and loyalty of the Boxers itself, declared war on the foreigners and laid siege to the legation quarter. In response, at the beginning of August 8th, countries Russia, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Austria, and the USA assembled a force of 54,000 soldiers, and within 2 weeks occupied Beijing, while Russia also marched into Manchuria. China was now at the mercy of the treaty powers. Peace negotiations, the Boxer Protocol. Once the Boxer revolt was defeated, the emperor was forced to agree to foreign troops being stationed on the approaches of Beijing and to pay a large, by the standards of the time, an indemnity of 67 million pounds over 39 years at 4% interest. Paradoxically, this guaranteed Chinese unity, since the victorious powers would get less of the money if China was partitioned. It was in fact much more economical to continue this treaty port system, which gave the treaty powers a key position in the majority cities at minimal cost. In other words, they could dominate China without having to pay to police and administer large unwieldy colonies. After the defeat of the Boxer Revolt, 25 concessions and leases were scattered along the Chinese coast from Manchuria to Guangdong. The impact of Russian expansion in China on international relations. In October 1900, Britain, worried about the possible partition of China, negotiated the Yangtze Agreement with Germany. The two powers agreed that Chinese unity must be preserved and that China must remain open to foreign trade, the so-called open door policy. The agreement, however, was threatened by the Russian refusal to withdraw from Manchuria, as the Germans were unwilling to put pressure on Russia to withdraw because they had no wish to make an enemy of Russia in Europe. Britain had no means of opposing Russian encroachments in northern China. Effectively, Britain was now isolated in China, as Germany, France, and Russia had forced the far eastern triplets and were able to work together. And the USA pursued its own independent policy. It appeared that Russia would now be free to pursue its ambitions in Manchuria, Korea, and northern China. But there were to be dramatically checked by the conclusion of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in January 1902. Tension between Britain and Germany in South Africa. South Africa was vital for the security of the British Empire as it lay on the route to India. Initially, the main challenge to British power in southern Africa came from the former Dutch settlers, the Boers. They resented Britain's annexation of Cape Colony from the Dutch in 1814, and to escape British control, a large number migrated between 1836 and 1840 in what was called the Great Trek to found new settlements, which later became the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. In 1877, both states, which were threatened by the Zulus Agreement to annexation by the British. However, once the Zulus were defeated at the Battle of Ulidi, the Boers began to agitate for independence. This led to, in 1818, to the First Boer War. The Prime Minister, William Gladstone, sympathized for the demands, and in the Convention of Pretoria, August 1881, recognized their freedom to run their own affairs, although London was still theoretically responsible for their foreign policy. Germany and the Transvaal. With the German annexation of Southwest Africa in 1884, the British faced the threat that the Germans would try to extend their power eastwards to the borders of Transvaal by annexing the African kingdoms of Burgenland and Matabeleland. Under pressure from Cecil Rhodes, the Prime Minister of Cape Colony, steps were taken to prevent this. In 1889, the British government gave the rights to Rhodes' British South African Company to colonize and govern the whole area north of the Transvaal and between Mozambique, German Southwest Africa, and Analog, which was duly renamed Rhodesia in May 1895. The discovery of gold in Transvaal. The economic significance of the Transvaal was transformed by the discovery of gold there in 1886. Over the next 5 years, large numbers of British prospectors and adventurers poured in. Inevitably, this posed a challenge to the supremacy of the Boer population, and Paul Kruger, the president of the Transvaal, began to look to Germany to prevent the absorption of the Transvaal into the British Empire by 1894. The economy of the Transvaal was dominated by the Germans. German bankers controlled the Transvaal's national bank, and some 20% of the foreign investment in the state came from Germany. The Jameson raid on the German response. At the end of 1895, Cecil Rhodes launched a badly planned and unsuccessful attempt to overthrow the Boer government in the Transvaal. In the so-called Jameson raid, Germany could hardly remain indifferent to such a naked act of aggression. The Kaiser at first wanted to declare the Transvaal a German protectorate, send military aid to Kruger, and then summon a congress in Berlin, which would redraw the map of South Africa, but in the end, he was persuaded by his own diplomats that because the British sea power, there were just empty threats. Instead, he sent a telegram to Kruger congratulating him on preserving the independence of his country against attack. This caused intense resentment in Britain, as it was perceived to be Germany meddling in the private affairs of the Britain Empire. Windows belonging to German-owned shops were smashed, and for the first time, popular anti-German feeling became widespread and intense. The Boer War and Germany's inability to intervene. 4 years later, Kruger, who had rebuilt the Boer army and equipped it with modern German artillery, declared war on Britain, believing that France, Germany, and Russia would intervene and force Britain to make concessions. There could never be, as the historian A.J.P. Taylor in 1954 observed, a more favorable opportunity in theory for the continental powers to exploit British difficulties. Public opinion in France, Russia, and Germany was decidedly pro-Boer, and de Classe attempted to secure a joint intervention by these three powers. Why was he not successful? Again, to quote Taylor, the British Navy decided the issue in that it made large-scale military intervention physically impossible. Yet it was, if the three powers had set up a continental league or alliance, they might have been able to eventually to force Britain to agree to mediation or Congress. In practice, however, neither France nor Russia were ready to intervene against Britain unless they had German backing, but the Germans would only intervene if all three powers guaranteed the frontiers of each other states. France was unwilling to agree to this, as it refused to recognize the German annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, and Russia was too distracted by the situation in the Far East to undertake fresh commitments in Europe. Britain was therefore able to defeat the Boers in a long, drawn-out war, which ended only in 1902. Attempts to resolve tensions between imperial nations. Traditional diplomacy. Until the formation of the League of Nations in 1920, there was no international organization which could solve disputes between the imperial nations, as they were fully sovereign and not bound by international law. Nevertheless, there were often successful efforts to reduce and resolve tensions arising from
colonial rivalries. Each great power and minor power too had an ambassador backed up by an embassy in the capital of every independent state in the world. There was what one historian has called a universal system of liaison. This meant that ambassadors could consult and inform each other about their country's policies. A good ambassador like Francis Paul Cambon in London could discreetly advise on solving problems between his own country and the country to which he was posted. However, ambassadors were agents of their governments and alone could not take the initiative in resolving international tensions. Essentially, it was up to the governments, though their foreign offices and ambassadors, to attempt to resolve the tensions that frequently arose between them. International conferences. When complex problems involving more than one of the great powers were incapable of solution by simple treaties or agreements, the powers would summon a congress or conference. These acted, to quote the historian Alfred Zimmern, as a safety valve when there was a particular acute crisis. Their decisions were published in formal documents known as treaty agreements, final acts, or conventions. Once the issue had been solved, even if only temporarily, the conference was dissolved and there was no permanent organization and its own secretariat to prepare for the calling of another. The Berlin West African Conference, 1884. In 1884, the Berlin West African Conference was held in Berlin to regulate the complex situation in the Congo. Both France and the International Association of the Congo, AICE, under the presidency of King Leopold, suspected that the newly signed Anglo-Portuguese treaty, which recognized Portuguese control over the lower Congo, was merely an attempt by Britain to exploit Portugal's weakness to increase its own influence in the Congo. In 1884, Germany and France were able to cooperate and override British objections to calling an international conference in Berlin of 15 countries, including the USA and Turkey, to decide on the future of the Congo. It was decided that this was to be administered by Leopold's AICE, and Portuguese control was to be limited to Angola. The conference was agreed on a treaty which laid down some important ground rules for a huge belt of Central African territory stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The entire area was to be a free trade zone, and all states were to have free access to the rivers and ports of the region for their trade. Religious missions and scientific research were to be protected. The slave trade was to be banned in that area, and the powers committed themselves to bring home the blessings of civilization. They also agreed that rules should be set defining effective occupation and informing the other powers when this had taken place, although this initially only applied to coastal districts. The Hague Conferences, 1899 and 1907. It was only in 1998 that the great powers began to consider the creation of a more permanent organization for dealing with disagreements between different states. That year, the Tsar of Russia proposed an international conference to consider disarmament and the peaceful settlement of international disputes. When it met in 1899, there was little agreement on disarmament, but considerable progress was made in resolving future tensions between states through making arrangements for commissions of inquiry and arbitration. A permanent court of arbitration was set up to be composed of judges nominated by the states, which had signed the arbitration agreement. Its greatest success was the settling of a dispute between between Britain and Russia when Russian warships on the way to fight the Japanese fired on British trawlers on the Dodger Bank. The Second World Conference at the Hague in 1907 achieved little apart from banning countries from using force to collect international debts from states delaying or refusing payment. Provision was made to call a third conference in 1914, but the war intervened. Why did Japan emerge as a world power, and what was the impact on international relations? 1.3 Reasons for rapid modernization and military development. Since the early 17th century, Japan had been ruled by the Tokugawa dynasty, which did its utmost to isolate Japan from the rest of the world and to preserve a rigid class system. However, by 1850, there was increasing demand for change from many of the Japanese nobility, the merchant class, and the poverty-stricken peasantry. The unequal treaties. Significantly, there was also a growing awareness that Japan's traditional isolation was threatened by the expansion of the Western powers into China. These fears were confirmed when the USA sent a naval squadron under Commodore Perry to Japan in 1853 to demand the opening up of two ports to international trade and also their use of the U.S. Navy. Japan had little option but to agree, and soon similar privileges were extended to Britain, France, and Russia. They were based on the treaties which the Western powers had made with China, and because they gave the Americans and Europeans such privileges, they were quickly named the unequal treaties. People from overseas were allowed to live and trade under specially designated ports to encourage trade. Tariffs were to be kept at a low level. The laws of their own countries administered through consular courts. The Meiji Restoration. In 1868, a political revolution broke out, which resulted in the restoration of the power of the emperor, the so-called Meiji Order. This marked the victory of the Westernizers, the modernizers, who in the course of the next 30 years began to transform the Japanese state. A central administration was created which controlled the local authorities and ensured that an effective tax system could be introduced to provide the government with money, a legal system based on the Western practice that was introduced, and in 1890 a new constitution was drawn up with an elected House of Representatives and a cabinet. A new army was created with a 3-year universal conscription. By 1883, it had wartime strength of 200,000 and a general staff on the German model. At the same time, progress was made in constructing a navy. By 1894, the Japanese Navy had 28 warships and 24 torpedo boats. Successful efforts were also made to modernize the Japanese textile industry and to introduce steam-powered factories. International recognition of Japan as a world power. Wars with China 1894 to 95, Russia 1905, and the treaty with Britain 1902. After 1878, the main aim of Japanese foreign policy was to negotiate the modification of the so-called unequal treaties of 1853, in particular the clauses which prevented Japan from setting its own tariffs and allowed overseas nationals working in the treaty ports to be independent of Japanese law extraterritorially. The negotiations were long and drawn out, and frequently their lack of success led to outbursts of nationalism in Japan. Only in 1889 was extraterritoriality abolished, but Japan did not obtain complete freedom to set its own tariffs until 1911. War with China, 1895. Up to 1884, while Japan was still building up its economic and military strength, it pursued a conciliatory policy with its neighbors. The status of Korea was, however, an issue that was eventually to cause conflict with China. Japan perceived Korea to be a Japanese satellite, even though China claimed to exercise ultimate power over it. In 1876, Japan forced Korea to open its ports to Japanese traders and, in defense of China's claims, negotiated a treaty with Korea which recognized it as a state of independent of China. In December 1884, Korean modernizers who wanted their country to look more to Japan than to China attempted to seize control of Korea. Potentially, this could have caused a Sino-Japanese war, but neither power was yet in the position to take risk conflict. By the convention in 1885, Tinsen, both powers agreed not to change the status of Korea, but mutual distrust still continued. The Japanese, for instance, were suspicious of China's efforts to increase its trade with Korea. Growing economic and military strength led to a change of Japanese policy towards Korea. Japan's chance to strengthen its position in Korea came in 1894 when the Tonghaks attempted to overthrow the Korean government. The King of Korea immediately turned to China for help to crush the revolt. Chinese troops were sent, but Japan argued that this broke the Tunisian Treaty and also sent a military force to protect its own position in Korea. Under pressure from the army, the political parties, and patriotic activists, the Japanese government was ready to challenge China. The Prime Minister, Ito Hirobumi, was also convinced that the political and economic gains from war far outbalanced the international risks. When Japan refused to withdraw its forces, China declared war. Although the Japanese army was smaller than the Chinese, it was better motivated and organized. As well as possessing more modern weapons, the Chinese were defeated by Pyongyang in North Korea and their fleet destroyed in the month of the Yalu River. The Japanese then went on to seize the Pescadores Islands and Taiwan. In April, the Chinese had little option but to accept the Treaty of Shimonoseki. By the treaty, China recognized Korea's independence and ceded to Japan Taiwan, the Pescadores, and the Liang Peninsula, where the important port of Port Arthur. Shimonoseki, however, proved a humiliating intervention by Russia, France, and Germany, and forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China. Japan under pressure, 1895 to 1902. At home, these concessions were met with bitterness as they indicated that Japan was still not in position to ignore pressure from the great powers. The government therefore decided at considerable financial cost to accelerate its armament programme. The fighting strength of the army was doubled and the navy greatly increased in size. Until this programme was complete, it faced further challenges from Russia and the other Western powers in China. In Korea, Russia had supplanted China as the main challenge to Japanese influence. Another unsuccessful attempt by Tonghak groups to seize power led to murder of the Korean queen and the flight of the king to the Russian legation. This enabled the Russians to increase their influence in Korea and gave them the excuse to send a military mission to Seoul. But in 1898, through the Nishirosen Agreement, both countries agreed not to interfere in Korean policies. In China, the French, British, Germans, and Russians were all expanding their power and creating spheres of influence, which threatened to exclude Japan. Russia was building up its power in Manchuria and took over Port Arthur in Liaodong, which Japan had been prevented in 1895 from doing. In response to the Boxer Revolt, Japan demonstrated its interest in the future of China by providing the largest contingent of troops to the international force sent to relieve the Beijing legations. However, when Russia used the revolt as an excuse to strengthen their forces in Manchuria, Japan faced a major challenge to its ambitions in Korea. The Anglo-Japanese Treaty of 1902. By the autumn of 1900, it was becoming clear that to defend its interests in China and Korea, Japan would either have to align itself with France, Germany, and Russia, or with Britain. Both choices would create problems for Japan. A. British alliance would tie Japan to supporting the policy of the open door in China, which aimed to preserve free trade in the Chinese Empire, whereas Japan preferred to carve out its own sphere of influence. On the other hand, cooperation with Russia could be possible only at the cost of accepting Russian domain of Manchuria, Korea, and northern China. As this would seriously challenge Japan's interest in Korea, it turned to Britain with a proposal for an alliance. To protect their interests, Japan and Britain negotiated a defensive alliance. Japan recognized Britain's intentions in Korea and China, while Britain accepted that Japan was in a peculiar degree politically as well as commercially and industrially interested in Korea. Both powers then went on to agree in January 1902 that if these interests were threatened, each power would be free to take the necessary action to protect them. In the event of war between Japan and another country, Britain would remain neutral unless a third power came to that other country's assistance. Similarly, if Britain were involved in the conflict in the Far East, Japan would only intervene if a third power declared war against Britain. The advantage to Japan of this agreement was that in any future conflict with Russia, the alliance with Britain would deter intervention by Germany or France. The Russo-Japanese War 1904 to 05. When it became clear by 1904 that Russia would not withdraw troops from Manchuria and cede to Japan a dominant position in Korea, the Anglo-Japanese Treaty enabled Japan to launch a surprise attack on Port Arthur. The subsequent Russo-Japanese War was fought in isolation. Neither France, which had just signed a colonial agreement with Britain, the Entente, nor Germany wanted to fight Britain, and each feared that its involvement in a Far Eastern war would make it vulnerable to an attack in Europe. Both Britain and the USA gave Japan loans to finance the war, provided there was a firm Japanese commitment to the open door in China. The Japanese victory in the Russo-Japanese War marked Japan's emergence as one of the imperial powers. It showed that it could defeat a European rival. Initially, there was fighting in Korea and along the coast of the direction of Liaotung. In April, a Japanese naval victory outside Port Arthur gave Japan control of the seas and enabled it to move troops by ship to North Korea, where they crossed the Yalu River and advanced into Manchuria. In May, a second Japanese army landed in the Liaotung Peninsula and laid siege to Port Arthur, which fell in January 1905. The way was then clear for a Japanese advance towards Mukden. After the defeat of the Russian fleet at Tsusami, which had been forced to hail halfway around the world by Britain's refusal to allow it through the Suez Canal, and of the Russian army at Mukden, the Russian government, paralyzed by large-scale unrest at home, agreed to a mediation by the U.S. president in August 1905. By the terms of the Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Russia ceased to be an immediate threat to either Britain or Japan in the Far East and withdrew from Korea and Manchuria. Russia gave Japan a free hand in Korea, and Japan also took over the Russian lease of Liaodong and the railway that linked it to Harbin, the South Manchurian Railway. What were the reasons for Japan's victory? By initially agreeing to the unequal treaties and then acting cautiously until the 1890s, when it was strong enough to assert its independence, it avoided the fate of China, domination by the imperial powers. It built up its armed forces and a modern financial and industrial infrastructure. It had also inherited the ancient Japanese traditions of loyalty to the emperor and state. In 1889, both the Meiji Constitution and the Imperial Prescription Proclamation on education emphasized that subjects of the Japanese emperor should, in an emergency, offer themselves courageously to the state. A British observer of the Russo-Japanese War, General Sir Ian Hamilton, attributed their successes to the fact that they have behind them the moral character produced by mothers and fathers who, again, are the product of generations of mothers and fathers nurtured in ideas of self-sacrifice and loyalty. Japanese policy in Korea, Manchuria, and China, 1906 to 1914. After the victories of 1905, the Japanese government came under increasing pressure from the patriotic societies, particularly the Black Dragon Society, to pursue much more aggressive policies, not only in Korea, Manchuria, and China, but also to occupy Mongolia and Siberia. These ideas appealed to the officer corps, who believed that Japan should at all costs preserve its gains from the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1906, the government rejected the army's demands that in return for a military withdrawal from Manchuria, Japan should retain a number of administrative rights there, which would in fact ensure its dependence on Japan. The government believed that it was more important to cultivate trade with China and keep good relations with the USA and Britain. This tension between the army and civilian ministers was to become more acute after the end of the First World War. Even if it had failed to convince ministers in 1906, it continued with some success to press its arguments on the government, and as a result, in the years to the outbreak of the First World War, Japan steadily strengthened its position in both Manchuria and Korea. In 1910, a secret agreement between Japan and Russia divided Manchuria into Russian and Japanese spheres of interest, Russian in the north and Japanese in the south. The reason for this was that neither country wanted to open up trade in Manchuria to the other powers. In 1910, Japan also annexed Korea outright. Initially, in 1906, the Japanese had allowed the Korean self-government subject to overall all control from Tokyo, but in the face of growing nationalist opposition and attempts to regain its independence, it annexed Korea outright. The army and the cabinet disagreed about how to react to the Chinese Revolution of 1911 to 12. The army, backed by the Black Dragon Society, wanted to exploit the chaos of the revolution to create an independent Manchuria under a puppet ruler. As needed, it was to do in 1932. The Japanese government was more cautious, and once the Chinese politician Yuan Shigeaki was able to establish what promised to be a more stable regime in China, Japan followed Britain's and the USA's lead in supporting it. The reason for this cautious policy was that Japan had built up a considerable economic stake in China by 1914. Some 20% of its exports went there, and it wanted to safeguard this trade. Japan's role in the First World War and global position by 1918. The terms of the Anglo-Japanese Treaty did not require Japan to enter the war as an ally of Britain, but Japan declared war on Germany on August 23, 1914, in order to seize the German concessions in Shandong in China and annex the German Pacific Islands. Japan refused to send any troops to Europe, but its navy helped Britain ensure that security to the Pacific Ocean, Japan's primary interest, was to strengthen the economic and political hold on China while its rivals were distracted by the war in Europe. In January 1915, China was presented with the 21 demands by the Japanese government, which would grant Japan privileged territorial and economic concessions, as well as the right to appoint military, financial, and police advisors to the Chinese government. In the face of the Chinese hostility, Japan dropped its demands for appointing advisors, but through an ultimatum gained the rest of their demands. Japan's seizure of the German concessions in Shandong province was confirmed. Japan was also able to extend its lease of the South Manchurian Railway Zone to 99 years and to gain control of the Haimping mining and agricultural plants, which already owed Japan vast sums of money. China agreed not to grant any more coastal or island concessions to any other power but Japan. Further economic concessions were acquired in exchange for a series of loans made to China in 1917. In 1918, in the short term, it was hoped that the loans would consolidate the power of the pro-Japanese Prime Minister John Kerry and enable him to defeat his rivals. However, this ultimate aim was, in the words of the Japanese businessman Nishari Kamazi, who negotiated the loans to develop the limitless resources of China and the industry of Japan by coordinating the two, so as to make possible a plan for safe sufficiency under which Japan and China would become a single entity. By 1918, Japan was the leading power in East Asia. Russia, by a secret treaty in 1916, recognized its growing mining and railway interests in Manchuria, while Britain, France, and Italy recognized its claims to Germany's former rights in Shandong and the Pacific Islands. When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, it recognized that Japan's geographical position gave it a special position in China, which it was entitled to protect. Why did the USA emerge as a world power, and what was the impact on international relations? 1.4. Impact of the closing of the frontier of the U.S. foreign policy. Since gaining independence from Britain in 1783, we're starting. Why did the USA emerge as a world power, and what was the impact on international relations? 1.4. Impact of the closing of the frontier on U.S. foreign policy. Since gaining independence from Britain in 1783, the energies of the USA had been, for the most part, concentrated on extracting its frontiers westward at the expense of the Native Americans. By the mid-1890s, this process was virtually complete. A network of railroads extended from east to west in some 8 million acres of territory, which had originally been designated as Indian Territory, was open to U.S. settlers. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier was now closed. By that, it meant that there was no longer a frontier line beyond which the population density was less than 2 persons per square mile. Some historians argue that the 1890s marked a turning point in U.S. foreign policy, like in Europe powers between 1898 and 1914. The USA began to acquire colonies and protectorates in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines, for example, and show an interest in establishing spheres of interest in China. Others, on the other hand, argue that U.S. foreign policy in the 1890s was merely a logical development from past trends. What cannot be denied, however, is that the 1890s witnessed, as in Britain, an outburst of Jiganism in the USA, which was caused by both pride in American achievements and foreboding about the future in the eyes of some contemporary commentators. The closing of the frontier marked the emergence of the American nation, which, according to the Kennedy journalist Henry Watterson, was destined to exercise a controlling influence upon the actions of mankind and to affect the future of the world. An impressive exhibition, the Columbian Exposition, was held in Chicago in 1893 to mark the nation's coming of age after Columbus's discovery of America 400 years earlier. At the exhibition, a contemporary historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, gave a lecture about which was later published under the title The Significance of the Frontier in American History, that caught the imagination of the public. He argued that U.S. democracy had been shaped by the availability of land beyond the frontier in the West, which had enabled generations of U.S. settlers to become sturdy, self-supporting, independent farmers. This became known as the frontier thesis. Although it was a positive explanation of the U.S. national character, it could also be given a more pessimistic interpretation by raising the question whether the closure of the frontier would undermine the country's unique values and character. These fears were further fueled by threatening developments, which were both internal and external. The severe economic depression of 1893 created unemployment, which led to a wave of demonstrations and strikes that seemed to threaten revulsion. There were also threats from abroad with the emergence of Japan and Germany as imperial powers, while the scramble for Africa and the threat to China showed the dynamism and aggression of European imperialism. It was feared that the influx of immigrants from the Mediterranean countries in Eastern Europe would dilute the traditional ethnic composition of the USA. The rapid growth of great cities with their social problems and slums also led to the creation of a new world very different from frontier America. The historian Richard Hofstadter had described with some exaggeration the 1890s as a time of psychotic crisis.
for American society, which Americans sought escape by supporting an aggressive foreign policy. This interpretation would seem to be backed up by an observation by the Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lounge. This was assertive foreign policy could knock on the head the matters which have embarrassed us at home. Yet while the 1890s were indeed an unsettling time for Americans, which the closing of the frontier came to symbolize, there were other factors which also determined U.S. foreign policy during this decade: economic growth and the need for trade in the late 19th century. By 1890, the USA had developed an industrial economy as well as a large agricultural sector. Like their counterparts in Europe, American industrialists and farmers needed markets for their goods and produce. The situation was made even more acute by a series of economic crises in the mid-1880s, which peaked in the Great Depression of 1893 to 97. The historian William A. Williams argued that the American government was convinced that American domestic well-being depends upon ever-increasing overseas economic expansion for both industrial and agricultural products. Manufacturers and industrials stress the need both to safeguard traditional markets in South America and open up new ones in China. For instance, the U.S. government, together with Britain, supported the open door policy that would open up international Chinese market to American and European trade. Public opinion and the government were also swayed by Captain Alfred Mahan's influential book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, which was published in 1890. This argued that the USA must abandon its conscientialist strategy and instead build up a large navy and merchant marine to compete for world trade and acquire colonies for raw materials and bases. In the 1890s, the U.S. government followed this advice and began to construct a formidable navy, which gave it the ability to project its power globally. Between 1898 and 1913, the fleet expanded from 11 battleships to 36, and special gunboats, for example, were designed to protect U.S. concessions in China. Despite the fear of psychic crisis of the 1890s, by 1912, the USA was a major trading power. Its national wealth doubled between 1900 and 1912. And its investments abroad rose from $700 million in 1897 to $3.5 billion by 1914. It was also a leading global power in technology and manufacturing, and had pioneered modern mass industrial production. Reason for and the impact of the Spanish-American War. The historian John Herring has called the Spanish-American War the pivotal event of a pivotal decade, which marked the USA's emergence as a world power. The situation in Cuba. The war was caused by a revolution in the Spanish colony of Cuba in 1890. A free trade treaty between Spain and the USA caused a short-lived economic boom on the island, but it ended abruptly in 1894 when the USA introduced a tariff which discriminated against Cuban sugar, the island's main product. This caused widespread economic devastation and political unrest, which was quickly exploited by Cuban exiles in the USA. In 1895, Jose Marti returned to stir up a revolt against the Spanish. This led to a prolonged and brutal struggle between the Spanish and the rebels, which by 1898 had resulted in a stalemate. Causes of U.S. intervention. Historians argue over whether the war was an aberration and caused by sensationalist reports in the yellow press, which put irresistible pressure on a supposedly weak president, William McKinley, or whether it was the consequence of deliberate U.S. intentions to pursue a more assertive and global foreign policy. The USA could not afford to ignore the situation in Cuba, as it had important trading interests on the island. In 1897, 87% of Cuba's exports went to the USA, and the value of U.S. investments and trade with the island was $150 million, approximately $2.5 billion in today's prices. The war also threatened U.S.-owned sugar estates, mines, and ranches, as well as the safety of U.S. citizens in Cuba. The yellow press undoubtedly whipped up hostility towards Spain, as it depicted the Spanish as the most brutal of oppressors, but it alone did not cause U.S. intervention. A complex mixture of factors were in play. The divided Democrat Party saw in U.S. intervention a chance to unite their party, and in turn put pressure on the Republicans to pursue a tough line against Spain to head off Democrat opposition. The U.S. elites increasingly argued that the USA, as a rising world power, must act to create order in its own backyard. William McKinley, who became president in 1897, intended to drive Spain out of Cuba, but initially he hoped to do so without resorting to war. Whether this could have been done peacefully is debatable, but two incidents made war between USA and Spain inevitable. The first was a leaked letter from the Spanish ambassador in Washington, which caricatured McKinley as a weak man seeking cheap publicity and also hinted that Spain's promise to give the Cubans greater autonomy was not seriously meant. The U.S. press seized upon it, and one newspaper claimed that it was the worst insult to the United States in its history. A few days later, the USA battleship the Maine blew up in Havana Harbor, killing 266 soldiers. This was almost certainly the result of an internal explosion, not of Spanish aggression, but the press pinned the blame on the Spanish. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, became a popular slogan, and both the public and Congress demanded war. McKinley had little option but to send troops to Cuba, while he described as neutral intervention to install a Cuban government, which would, as his supporters in Congress stressed, be of practical advantage to the United States. The Teller Amendment, passed by Congress, specifically forbade him to annex the island. The Spanish-American War. Cuba was conquered in 4 months. At the time, the U.S. fleet destroyed the Spanish naval forces protecting Manila in the Spanish Philippines. When Spain asked for peace terms in August 1898, the USA insisted on the surrender of not only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, but also the Spanish Pacific islands of Guam and Hawaii. Initially, the defeat of Spain was welcomed by the Filipinos, who optimistically expected it to lead to independence. When McKinley disappointed them by placing the Filipinos under U.S. control, the USA was faced with a guerrilla war, which they won only in 1904 after a long and bloody struggle. The impact of the Spanish-American War, the USA as a world power, 1904 to 1916. The war destroyed the Spanish Empire and marked the USA's emergence as a potential world power. Its influence could no longer be ignored by the European powers. The USA became, in George Herring's words, a full-fledged member of the Imperial Club by establishing a protectorate over Cuba and seizing Hawaii, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico as colonies. It was unable to strengthen its grip on Central America and the Caribbean through dollar diplomacy backed by military power where necessary. In that way, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua became colonies of the USA in all but name. Liberia in West Africa, which had been founded as an independent state for formerly enslaved people, was similarly subjected to dollar diplomacy when its existence was threatened by civil war and foreign debts in 1908. A U.S. loan was arranged, a warship sent to crush the revolt, and a U.S. Army officer was given responsibility for building up Liberia's frontier force. The USA brought pressure to bear on Colombia to surrender the Isthmus of Panama, which was effectively placed under U.S. control so that the Panama Canal could be constructed. Thanks to the annexation of the Philippines, the USA also became a more powerful force in the Pacific and East Asia. It was, for example, able to mediate between Russia and Japan and persuade them to accept the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. A key motive for this intervention was fear that a total Japanese victory over Russia would make the Philippines and Hawaii vulnerable to Japanese sea power. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt, also an underappreciated act of U.S. policy, intervened in European policies, responding to an appeal from Kaiser William of Germany to mediate in the dispute between French and German control over Morocco. He played an important role in the AICE conference and skillfully maneuvered the Kaiser into accepting an agreement which favored France. Even when the Democrat Woodrow Wilson was elected,
president in 1912 on an anti-imperialist platform, U.S. policy did not change. Faced with political instability in the Caribbean and Central America, he pursued a policy very similar to McKinley and Roosevelt. U.S. troops were sent to Cuba, Panama, Hispaniola, and Haiti, while Nicaragua became a protectorate. The USA also intervened in the Civil War in Mexico in an attempt to restore order and to prevent a government hostile to its interests being established. In March 1916, when rebel troops actually attacked the U.S. border of town of Columbus in New Mexico, Wilson sent a punitive expedition to destroy the rebel forces. Both countries came to the brink of war, but in 1917, after torturous negotiations, the U.S. expeditionary force was withdrawn. Wilson could not afford a war that would need at least 500,000 troops to defeat the rebels at a time when war with Germany was imminent. Reasons for the USA's entry into the First World War and its subsequent impact. When war broke out in Europe in August 1914, the reaction of the majority of Americans was relief that their country was neutral. Although Wilson himself and the majority of the USA elites favored the Allies, many Americans did not. Many German Americans naturally supported their former homeland, while a deep distrust of Britain was common among Irish Americans, and many Jewish Americans hated anti-Semitic Imperial Russia. Growing economic links between the Allies and the USA. Nevertheless, there were powerful economic factors that were to influence the USA in favor of the Allies. Britain needed to purchase weapons, explosives, and food from the USA. Given that the British naval blockage of Germany prevented the USA from trading with the Central Powers, U.S. industry was delighted with the volume of order which they received from Britain, and to pay for these orders, U.S. banks were ready to loan the British government millions of dollars. In May 1916, this amounted to about $10 million a day. In effect, as Wilson's advisor, Colonel House, admitted in the spring of 1950, the USA state was bound up more or less in an eventual Allied victory. The German U-boat threat, 1915. The only way the Germans could halt the steady flow of munitions and vital supplies from across the Atlantic to Britain was to deploy U-boats, submarines, around the British Isles to sink shipping bringing imports to Britain. For Germany, this ran the risk of sinking U.S. vessels, which could lead to eventual confrontation with Washington. On May 7, 1915, the British liner the Lusitania was sunk off the Irish coast of a German U-boat, killing 1,198 people, which included 128 Americans. At first, the Germans responded to Wilson's protest by pointing out quite correctly that the liner had munitions in its hold, but the German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, realizing that it was more important to keep the USA out of war than to wage unrestricted submarine warfare, promised that no more passenger ships would be sunk without warning. It was only this assurance that kept the USA out of the war. U.S. declaration of war. Bethmann Hollweg was reluctant to risk a rupture with the USA, but in January 1917, against his better judgment, he pushed by the German High Command into sanctioning unrestricted submarine warfare against all ships trading with the Allies. On the optimistic assumption that this would rapidly defeat Britain, predictably, U.S. shipping and commerce suffered severely from the U-boat attacks. Any remaining doubts about abandoning neutrality were removed when, in February, the British gave Wilson the text of a telegram from the German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico, which they had intercepted. It revealed that if the USA entered the war on the Allied side, the Germans would ally with Mexico and encourage a Mexican invasion of New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. On April 6, President Wilson declared war on the Central Powers as an associated power, rather than an ally of the Entente powers. This distinction, Wilson hoped, would enable him to pursue, when necessary, a policy independent of the Entente. The USA as a belligerent. The U.S. declaration of war was a development of immense importance because the manpower reserves and economic strength of the USA would now be available to the Allies. On the other hand, it would take the USA at least a year to train and equip an army that could fight in France. The, the Russian revolutions of February-October 1970, which resulted in Russia leaving the war, gave the Germans a window of opportunity to launch one last great offensive against British and French in the West. In March 1918, U.S. troops under General Pershing played a part in halting this at the Second Battle of the Marne in July, and by September there were no more than 1 million U.S. troops in France. At the Battle of Argonne, September 26th to November 11th, they won a major victory over the Germans that hastened the end of the war. The USA and Russia. In Russia, the February Revolution had swept away the Tsarist regime. The new provincial government initially promised to fight a people's war against the Germans. It hoped that carrying on the war under a new democratic regime would ignite a great burst of popular enthusiasm. Wilson welcomed the new regime and promised 450 million in aid, but the Russian army was in no state to fight. Its morale was low and discipline was undermined by the Bolsheviks, who seized power in October and were determined to pull Russia out of the war. This achieved in March 1918 what Lenin, the Bolshevik leader, signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. In a desperate but ultimately unsuccessful attempt to keep Russia in the war, the Allies and the USA tried to support the White Russians, who were hoping to overthrow the Bolsheviks by force with both money and small number of troops. To help achieve this, Wilson agreed in June 1918 to send a force of 20,000 troops to Siberia. An added reason for this step was to block any Japanese plans for taking over Siberia. Allied and U.S. intervention was to achieve little and by 1920 the Bolsheviks had won the civil war in Russia. The 14 points in the armistice, November 1918. By the early autumn of 1918, the USA had emerged as potentially the most powerful of the states waging war against the Central Powers. Wilson and his advisors were ready to exploit this position to ensure what they called a just peace. On January 8, 1918, in a speech to Congress, Wilson had proclaimed that the USA wanted a peace of no annexations, no contributions, no punitive damages, and in the 14 points outlined how this would be achieved. When on September 28th, after further military defeats in the West, the German military leadership conceded defeat, the German elite, in the words of the historian Holger Herweg, embraced the 14 points, such like a drowning person reaches for a lifeline. To impress President Wilson that it was now a democratic country, Germany rapidly created a parliamentary government, which on October 4th asked William for an immediate armistice on the basis of the 14 points. Similar requests came from Bulgaria, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, all of which faced immediate defeat by the Allied forces. However, Germany's immediate hopes of dividing its enemies and achieving an armistice based on the 14 points were dashed when Wilson asked the Allies to draft the details of the armistice agreements. They produced tough terms which anticipated their key aims at the coming peace conference and were to contradict the ideals of a Wilson peace.